All right, everyone, we're going to look at book or part 3 of Orwell's 1984 today, the rather discouraging conclusion to that oppressive novel, which we've charted over the last couple classes. And where we come to at this point is that O'Brien, the figure of O'Brien, who was an official within the inner party, who appeared to Winston Smith to be a member of the Brotherhood, this secret brotherhood that he had heard of, was in fact a trap and had been on the lookout for thought criminals like Winston Smith. And it's when we come to part 3, we find that the trap has been sprung. And Winston and Julia, who had up to that point been experiencing greater and greater freedom from Big Brother and had brought in the minds of the readers, at any rate, the possibility of some sort of means of escape from the oppression and the totalitarian control of Big Brother, there's a sudden and dramatic decline in that, which is as oppressive and dispiriting as it is sudden. Now, there were omens of that all along. There were means of foreshadowing. The songs that they were hearing on the streets, "They've Stolen My Heart Away," "Under the Spreading Chestnut Tree," "I Sold You and You Sold Me." Well, Winston had been meeting in the Chestnut Tree Cafe, where he saw Jones and Aronson and Rutherford shortly before they were declared to be unpersons. The song or rhyme that Smith remembers from his boyhood, "Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clemens," concludes as O'Brien informs him, "Here comes a chopper to chop off your head," invoking the alleged executions of the past. There's this sense of dramatic foreshadowing in that. And likewise in various other subtle ways. And these are the ways in which I think what Orwell does is create a sense of inevitability about the fact that they will be caught, and the fact that their little escapade in experiencing and delighting in freedom is actually just a means to out them and catch them, and ultimately to betray them. And that pervades the whole novel. So there's a sense, on the one hand, up to in parts 1 and 2, that they are experiencing more and more freedom, and that they might be able to escape from that. But in the end, there's also a decided sense that this freedom is impossible, and that ultimately they will be caught, and there is no escape from that. And that is how the novel concludes. And I'm just trying to find the beginning of the chapter that introduces the third part. So we get into Goldstein's theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism back in book 2, which I found interesting, because once again, I say to you that the main lesson, as it were, of 1984 is not about authoritarian governments, not even about totalitarian governments. Remember, the backdrop for this is the twin dangers of fascist Nazi Germany, but more particularly, and I actually think it's less about fascist Nazi Germany, it's more about communism, because remember, this book is published in 1949, after the Nazi regime has fallen. When Orwell writes this book, sequestered on the island of Jura, Scottish island, it really is a commentary on his own era. And I don't think that fascism is any longer a viable threat. It really is about the threat that has emerged in the wake of that, equally totalitarian, namely that of communism. But he's not talking about the dangers of communism per se and the means that it has at its disposal of spying on its citizens. That is certainly there. I mean, that's not that it's not there, but that's not the main thrust of Orwell's warning. The main thrust is, as I said to you last time, the danger of what governments of that nature do with language. And as I say, I draw your attention to this other work by Orwell, Politics in the English Language. Orwell is not only commenting about, in other words, about the Soviet Union or what happens in that regime, he's also commenting on how his own English-speaking country is slowly perverting language and turning into this sort of regime. He's not saying that it is so. He's saying that it could be so. And language is the means by which it comes about. It's used by governments to not only to obfuscate the truth, but also to subjugate their people. And it's the means by which the citizens are deprived of a means of resisting this oppression. If it's literally impossible to think in terms contrary to those that those in government wish us to think, then it becomes impossible to act, because thinking precedes actions. And in this, I think it's really interesting as Christians to reflect on the nature of language to actions. Now, this is not a Christian theme per se, or an exclusive Christian theme per se. The connection of thought and action is certainly there in the Greco-Roman world, and the importance of speech and rhetoric and flourishes in the classical world, and the means of speaking as a prelude to action, in fact, a sort of action, is certainly there in the classical world. But it's most particularly there in a deep theological sense in the Christian tradition. Because remember, in Scripture, Jesus is proclaimed to be the Word of God. And when it says that he is the Word of God in Scripture, it also says, say in John 1, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things were created by him and for him, and nothing that has been made was made without him, and so forth. So there's a connection between the word Hebrew word for word is davar. In John's Gospel, written in Greek, it's logos. Both words, davar in Hebrew and logos in Greek, have the connotations of not just word, but action. So when God speaks in Genesis 1 and brings the creation into being, when he speaks and says, let there be light, days, let there be, and then there's a separation, that language is not just a prelude to the actions, it's the means by which it comes about. So when God speaks, he acts. So it has that character. This word davar in Hebrew has that sense. In the Greek, it has a further implication. The word logos has the idea of the inner workings of things. So the mechanism, the function, the thing that, let's use the metaphor of an automobile. The logos is like the engine that drives the car. It's the inner mechanism that makes it possible for a car to move forward. We have in the word, in the English vocabulary, connection still there in the word logic. So there's a coherence, a lack of contradiction, a symmetry, and I would say we could even say a correspondence of our words to reality. So it's important that we use the right words to describe things. And the science of philosophy, as it stands, really is the science of using the right words to describe the right things. It's the science of naming. And with that in mind, that is an absolutely crucial aspect of the Christian theological, and not only that, just the scientific progress of the modern world, is naming things and understanding them in their inner workings, not just the logic, but giving them a right name and speaking true things about the nature of things. That's a product of the modern university. Even the medieval universities is doing precisely that, naming even things that are unseen rightly, and proclaiming what is orthodox and what is heretical or not true. First of all about God, but also about the created order. Well, when we come to Orwell's 1984, we find that it is exactly this that is that Big Brother wants to subvert. This correspondence of language with reality. And this is symbolized in the very simple equation 2 + 2 = 4. You'll recall back in book 1, Winston Smith says that it's impossible for Big Brother to make someone think that 2 + 2 is anything other than 4. You might be able to say that 2 + 2 is 5, but you cannot think it because it's literally unthinkable. It's because it's wrong. And so Smith represents, in some sense, a common sense consensus that had been a part of the big society that was being subverted and overcome by Big Brother. And that common sense was no longer permissible, because Big Brother was altering what reality was. And the purpose of that altering of reality is symbolized again in the symbol that O'Brien gives to us in his work of imagine a boot being crushed on the human face forever. That's a symbol of the future. So the famous quote here of book 3, what is it? No, that's it. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. O'Brien's famous words that echo after this and are, in some sense, symbolic of the general message of the modern totalitarian state, and in particular, its use of language. And its use of language is a way or a means of stamping upon the human face. Now, this is deeply significant. I am quite sure that Orwell is in no sense a professing Christian. It would be unfair to him to suggest that he was so. He did not claim it. And however, when we are altering language and the correspondence of words to truth, and when we consider the fact that we bear the image of God, we human beings bear the image of God, and that our words are one of the most important aspects of the expression of our human nature, being truthful in our conduct, trustworthy, and so forth. What is happening in the society of Big Brother is exactly the perversion of not only truth, but also of human nature. So there's a dehumanization that takes place in relation to human nature that pervades the whole novel. It makes certain words unwords, it makes certain persons unpersons, and particularly in general, it makes the human person that bears the image of God and says true things not only about God, but about human beings and their nature, the sacrosanct nature of human life. All of these things are becoming unsayable and unthinkable in the Orwellian society that George Orwell depicts. So this is a novel about language, and it's a novel about language and how language is perverted. And the term for this new language is newspeak. What Orwell's novel does, and I think this is a valuable contribution, is because he's so sensitive to the importance of truthful language, he comes up with words that describe phenomena that really are not things that had yet been experienced, but do come to characterize the world that has come after him. So words like Big Brother, for instance. There was a TV show reality TV show, so-called reality TV show, rather perversely termed reality TV show, called Big Brother not that long ago, a decade or 2 decades ago now, in which we observed people in real time acting duplicitously towards one another, we being the observers of that decadent behavior and so forth. Other words like the thought police or unperson or doublethink. And the aim of all this is not only to crush dissent, that's obviously there. And it's also not only to make dissent impossible, which is an explicit aim there in the novel. It's to make dissent impossible because you can't even think dissenting thoughts. They will be betrayed in your face, but the words will no longer exist. Note that one of the chief project of the Ministry of Truth, the ironically named Ministry of Truth, is to reformulate the dictionary, not only to rewrite history in the past so that it conforms with what the party says about reality in the present. Note that the party is acting like God in determining what the nature of reality is now, the nature of history, just as God, we are told, is the author of history, entered history, tells us the ultimate meaning of history, which is declared in eschatological terms in relation to the person and work of Jesus Christ and what he has done in bringing in not only a timeline for history. I mean, we still reckon our timelines in accordance with his life. So we have BC or AD, and even if you want to call it a common era, it's still the same dates. So the coming of Christ is a decisive historical turning point. Under any reckoning, whether even if you want, as the Secular Academy does, to erase all mention of Christ, the timeline still reflects that. Well, and that's because Christ has determined history decisively. There's a huge transformation come the advent of Christ, which is a large topic of discussion and really the subject matter of this course to some degree. And moving from the ancient world of Homer all the way to the present day, we have charted to some degree how the Christian mind has transformed human society and given a new value to human life, which was not there in the ancient world, and declared the integrity and significance of every individual human life. And those are the product of the fact that an individual bears the imago Dei, not known in the pagan world, denied in the pagan world, in fact, of Homer and of Virgil, for that matter. The Greco-Roman world denied these very things. But the Christian world asserts it, that an individual matters. Well, in Orwell's 1984, it is plain not only that individuals don't matter, but that the individual person of the person is being denied as having any reality. And that goes so far as to extend not only to their external activities, but even to what lies within their minds, namely their thoughts, their conscience. These things need to be erased. So it is a thoroughly anti-Christian, anti-theological turn. It's a bent of modern society, and it is aided and abetted by the transformation of language to reflect this dehumanization which is taking place. So this is why it's such a horrifying novel, is that it describes this very carefully. So when O'Brien in the third part here is torturing Winston Smith, he holds up his hand and he has 4 fingers and he asks Smith, "How many fingers do you see?" And Smith at first says, 4. What else can I say? 4. He gets tortured for that. Now, this is just a means of conditioning. As the torture progresses and Winston Smith under torture loses all sense of time as he's in this room. He's not exactly sure what and how long the torture has lasted. But as he continues to do this, Smith starts to wish to avoid the torture that he claims to see 5, as O'Brien wanted him to say. And O'Brien's response is, that's not enough. No, he says, Winston, it's no use. It's no use. You're lying. You still think there are four. So this is exactly what Big Brother wants us to do, is to think the right things, and in fact to agree with whatever Big Brother says about the nature of reality. So there's an element of coercion here. Now note again the compare and contrast the old theological framework of understanding of things, which is, yes, that words are to conform to reality. Nonetheless, there is a freedom to come to assert those things or not to. You can be false. You can be wrong in this. It's possible, and so forth. And being wrong in it is not punished with the dire means by which it happens under the auspices of Big Brother. You are not tortured for coming up with a wrong answer. And furthermore, the nature of God being love is that he draws people to himself. He calls them to repentance. He encourages them to do so. There can be no coercion in true religion. God does not compel us to belief. He gives us his spirit out of grace and draws us to take hold of the outstretched hand that reaches out to us. So there's a lack of coercion, but there is a clear attraction there. In accordance with the nature of God, who is loving and we bear his image, respond also out of love to the loving embrace. We see nothing of that here. We see the exact opposite. There will not only be no freedom, it's totally banished from here, there will also be no love that is allowed. And so when Smith is in this relationship with Julia, it's clear that the reason that they are attracted to this is simply rebellious. And it's an expression of the freedom that they hold as well. It's just a rebellious action. And the words that they want to use. Now, Winston Smith has larger designs for this action than does Julia. Julia just wants to rebel in terms of her bodily conduct. And when Winston says this of her, she's very pleased. It's true. Smith has larger designs. He wants the whole society, root and branch, to be subverted. And this is what draws him, ironically, into the clutches of O'Brien, is that he genuinely is a rebel, and he genuinely wants good things, which is why he's the hero in the book. But that is exactly what traps him in this. By the way, the word Orwellian, I think I said this at the outset, it's used to this very day in political discourse, often inappropriately. And it's almost always seen in terms of party politics. The left will accuse the right of being Orwellian, the left of being Orwellian. It's never us who are acting Orwellian. What's interesting about that is, I would say, how accurate that fits those that are being charged with being Orwellian lies in relation to how they use language. Is lying alternative facts? Is lying being truthy in our speech? Is that characteristic of the political party? And furthermore, is it not only duplicitous in its speech, does it require everyone else to conform to the same reality, to use the same words, to agree with this presentation of reality? To my mind, the charges that have been placed against the conservative establishment in our day, such as there is an establishment, and I don't think there is much of one, tend to fall short, because they don't really seem to or seek to make their language to be characteristic of discourse in general. As in, you must use these words as I mean them, or else you will be guilty of a crime against the persons of those, and particularly of the political order that is dictating this speech codes. But it does seem to be characteristic of the left in our day, as it was in Orwell's era. when the communists were not only spying on one another, but using a revisionist view of history to reflect the ideals of communist Marxism, and were airbrushing out the atrocities that had been committed along the way and were still being committed by Stalin, among others. They were engaging in the same sort of revision of history that we see in the novel 1984. In the same way, political correctness and the use of, to use more contemporary examples, the use of compelled speech in terms of pronouns and so forth, and the requirement that we not only acknowledge this, but how someone speaks, but we are required to use those exact same words. This is starting to move in the direction of compelled speech and compelled thinking, and an attempt to further more to capture conscience. Now, we have not yet come in any way, it seems to me, to the degree of Orwell's 1984, where there is such a thing as thought crime. But there is speech crime. And speech crime is not related to falsity. Those things have always been policed in the courts. So slander and fraud and diminishing a person's reputation and using language in ways that are to destroy a person's reputation. Those are long existing misuses of speech. This form of speech is to agree by compulsion to use certain words that the person using the words says doesn't meet the reality anymore. So really, at stake is the nature of reality and our capacity to understand it and identify it without somebody dictating to us what the reality is. And that's really what is Orwellian in contemporary applications of language. So we can talk about this all I want. There's a North Korean defector by the name of Yeonmi Park. Interesting observation. When she defected from North Korea to the South, to the Republic, she found that the vocabulary in South Korea was far richer than that of her, of the state that had been under communist rule for a generation. And she said, when you have more words to describe the world, you increase your ability to think complex thoughts. She read Orwell's 1984, as it turned out, and saw that this was an exact description of what was going on in North Korea, where she defected from. The point is the same. Language not only describes reality, it also, in some sense, shapes the way we see reality. So the discussion of language, the use of language, the misuse of language, the compulsion to use language that agrees with the party and the establishment and its view of what humanity is and what the good is for the state, these are the means by which Big Brother chiefly operates and are the chief thing that Orwell is describing to us as problematic about the state of Big Brother. So let me give you some discussions of this. I'm going to skip over the Winston Smith reading of the... No, I think some of these things are actually interesting. So this is these. I'm going to read you extracts from Goldstein's philosophy here, though it does good to take us back slightly to the second part rather than the third. But he notes that the aims of the group, the three groups, he talks about a high element of society, a middle, and a low. The aims of the high, he says, is page 210 in my book, is to remain where they are. The aim of the middle is to change places with the high. The aim of the low, when they have an aim, for it is an abiding characteristic of the low that they are too much crushed by drudgery to be more than intermittently conscious of anything outside their daily lives, is to abolish all distinctions and create a society in which all men shall be equal. Now, the single and singular contribution of Marxist thought is to liberate the proletariat, namely what Orwell calls the proles here, and to encourage the proletariat, that is what Orwell calls the low, to become the high, to seize the means of production. And to do that, they're not going to want to replace the high, they're going to want to abolish all distinctions altogether and create a society of equality. And those are the aims, most explicitly, I would say, characterizing the modern left. Not just communism, but the modern left in general. Back to the Orwell's discussion here. Thus, throughout history, a struggle which is the same in its main outlines recurs over and over again. For long periods, the high seems to be securely in power, but sooner or later, there always comes a moment when they lose either their belief in themselves or their capacity to govern efficiently, or both. They are then overthrown by the middle, who enlist the low on their side by pretending to them that they are fighting for liberty and justice. As soon as they've reached their objective, the middle thrusts the low back into their old position of servitude and themselves become the high. Presently, a new middle group splits off from one of the other groups or from both of them, and the struggle begins over again. Of the three groups, only the low are never even temporarily successful in achieving their aims. It would be an exaggeration to say that throughout history there has been no progress of a material kind. Even today, in a period of decline, the average human being is physically better off than he was a few centuries ago. But no advance in wealth, no softening of manners, no reform or revolution has ever brought human equality a millimeter nearer. From the point of view of the low, no historic change has ever meant much more than a change in the name of their masters. By the late 19th century, the recurrence of the pattern had become obvious to many observers. Now, when Orwell is writing this under the guise of Goldstein, I think this is actually Orwell's own observation, and I would share his discussion of this in general. There then arose a school of thinkers who interpreted history as a cyclical process and claimed to show that inequality was the unalterable law of human life. This doctrine, of course, had always had its adherents, but in the manner in which it was now put forward, there was a significant change. In the past, the need for a hierarchical form of society had been the doctrine specifically of the high. It had been preached by kings and aristocrats and by the priests, lawyers, and the like who were parasitical upon them. And it had generally been softened by promises of compensation in an imaginary world beyond the grave, reference to Christian truth, the kingdom of God, which will succeed this earthly kingdom. The middle, so long as it was struggling for power, had always made use of such terms as freedom, justice, and fraternity. Now, however, the concept of human brotherhood began to be assailed by people who were not yet in positions of command, but merely hoped to be so before long. In the past, the middle had made revolutions under the banner of equality, and then had established a fresh tyranny as soon as the old one was overthrown. The new middle groups, in effect, proclaimed their tyranny beforehand. Socialism, a theory which appeared in the early 19th century and was the last link in a chain of thought stretching back to the slave rebellions of antiquity, was still deeply infected by the utopianism of past ages. But in each variant of socialism that appeared from about 1900 towards the aim of establishing liberty and equality was more and more openly abandoned. Liberty and equality are more and more openly abandoned. The new movements that appear are Ingsoc in Oceania, Neo-Bolshevism in Eurasia, death worship, as it's commonly called in East Asia, had the conscious aim of perpetuating unfreedom and inequality. Now, this is where I would say Orwell's novel departs from reality as it has been experienced. There is no explicit desire and rejection of equality as an aim amongst the political left, which I said was better described by this novel than the political right, at least to my lights. But there is no explicit aim to produce unfreedom and inequality. The question is, however, in terms of application, does the subversion of language in the name of equality not get rid of the ultimate form of equality, namely the integrity and sanctity of the individual person? That's the question. Does it not do that? As soon as we start defining human nature, even if we do it for ourselves under the auspices of the authority of the state, so it's a law that we can declare what our own nature is it not the case that every human nature is being effectively sanctioned or authorized by the state? It's the state that determines what our human nature is. Even if it claims to give that authority back to us when we define ourselves, it's only done with the coercive power of the state, and therefore human nature itself is being rewritten. But Big Brother is there to allow this to happen, says Goldstein. He's the guise in which the party chooses to exhibit itself to the world. His function is to act as a focusing point for love, fear, and reverence, emotions which are more easily felt towards an individual than towards an organization. Nonetheless, it is the organization that is there, and the thought police is there to ensure that it happens. Part 3, as I said, concludes, or part 3 opens with the two having been caught. A voice comes out and speaks, tells them to not to move and to speak, to pick up the pieces of a broken glass paperweight. By the way, on the reference to this glass paperweight, he sees a fragment of coral. And what was interesting about this fragment of coral is the interior of the glass, he says, and I'm quoting here. There was such a depth to it, and yet it was almost as transparent as air. It was as though the surface of the glass had been the arch of the sky, enclosing a tiny world with its atmosphere complete. He had the feeling that he could get inside it, and in fact was inside it, along with the mahogany bed and the gate leg table and the clock and the steel engraving and the paperweight itself. The paperweight was the room he was in, and the coral was Julia's life and his own, fixed in a sort of eternity at the heart of the crystal. And what is interesting is Winston's picturing of his life with Julia inside this paperweight. So when the paperweight smashes on the ground, their little illusory relationship that had been kept from Big Brother is shattered along with it. They had imagined that this life that they had was sacrosanct and that it was untouched by Big Brother. But when the glass paperweight shatters, all of his illusions shatter along with it. And so we end up, part 3, in the ministry of love, the ironically named ministry of love, where they will, of course, be tortured. And the torture is a very particular sort. And let's come to that section here where we talk about what transpires there. And I'm not going to go through the entirety of it. I just want to draw to your attention that, as I said to you earlier, in the older understanding, not of the pagan world, but of the Christian world, God in his nature was love. And the relations of the whole cosmos towards mankind were understood to be loving. And everything acted in accordance with the logos, or logic, of love, in terms of human relationships, in terms of, so in ethics, in terms of politics. All of these things had been strongly and deeply connected with the rules of love, which required freedom, because love is not something that can be coerced. Obedience can be coerced in a dog. Love cannot. Love is a different thing in people. It's not something, it has to be freely offered and freely given. Now, to some degree, that's what Big Brother wants in terms of its devotion as well. But the way in which it achieves that is by making an alternative to loving Big Brother unthinkable. And so it manipulates language, first of all, but ultimately it will even crush the people and use torture in room 101, the, again, infamous room 101, to coerce people into thinking what Big Brother wants them to think. So yes, they will love Big Brother, but only because an alternative to doing so is now impossible even to consider. And then once they have done that, then and only then will they be shot and executed for their original actions. So we come here to into part 3, and I'm going to come to a couple choice scenes here. The one I'm going to look at, it's on page 268. Let me think. The section in which he started holding up the 4 fingers. Let me read you some of that dialogue, because I think it's quite helpful. This begins on 261. The scene here, O'Brien is torturing Winston Smith, who's strapped down to a bed, and his hands are on a dial, and the dial there puts a charge through Smith, which is torturous, and there are degrees at which it which it can be implemented, from mild to absolutely excruciating. And O'Brien in here in a dialogue, and O'Brien's a very intelligent individual who understands what he's doing, but he's utterly committed to the twisting of reality to conform to Big Brothers. So he's an utter ideologue. And O'Brien was looking at him, this is 260, speculatively. More than ever, he had the air of a teacher, making pains with a wayward but promising child. There is a party slogan dealing with the control of the past, he said. Repeat it, if you please. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, repeated Winston obediently. Who controls the present controls the past, said O'Brien, nodding his head with a slow approval. Is it your opinion, Winston, that the past has real existence? Again, the feeling of helplessness descended upon Winston. His eyes flitted towards the dial. What O'Brien is after is for it to be unthinkable that there is any reality outside of the words that the party says. They have to think and use the same words, and everything the party says is true because it says it. It's an appeal to authority, nothing other than that. And it's unthinkable that it should be otherwise. But Winston, because for him, words conform to a reality that lies outside of language and outside the mind. Now, modern views of language, by the way, are at odds with this. So Martin Heidegger's, I deal with this in my literary theory class, Martin Heidegger's view of language is that that reality conforms to our capacity to articulate it. Rather than words conforming to reality, reality conforms to our language. It's called the linguistic turn, for those of you who are interested. As I say, I'll deal with that next semester, next year, rather, in contemporary literary theory. But he says this, back to the question, is it your opinion, Winston, that the past has real existence? The feeling of helplessness descended upon Winston. His eyes flitted towards the dial. He's fearful of what's coming. He not only did not know whether yes or no was the answer that would save him from pain, he did not even know which answer he believed to be the true one. Winston smiled faintly. You are no metaphysician, Winston, he said. Until this moment, you had never considered what is meant by existence. I will put it more precisely. Does the past exist concretely in space? Is there somewhere or other a place, a world of solid objects where the past is still happening? No. Then where does the past exist, if at all? In records. It is written down. in records and in the mind, in human memories, in memory. Very well then. We, the party, control all records, and we control all memories. When we control the past, then we control the past, do we not? But how can you stop people remembering things? Cried Winston again, momentarily forgetting the dial. It is involuntary. It is outside oneself. How can you control memory? You have not controlled mine. O'Brien's manner grew stern again. He laid his hand on the dial. On the contrary, he said, you have not controlled it. That is what has brought you here. You are here because you have failed in humility. In self-discipline, you would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity. You prefer to be a lunatic, a minority of one. Only the disciplined mind can see reality, Winston. You believe that the reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right. You also believe that the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everyone sees the same thing as you. But I tell you, Winston, that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes, and in any case soon perishes. Only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. Whatever the party holds to be truth is truth. It is impossible to see reality except by looking through the eyes of the party. That is the fact that you have got to relearn, Winston. It needs an act of self-destruction, an effort of the will. You must humble yourself before you can become saint. Note that it entails an act of self-destruction. And what is the nature of the act of self-destruction? It's the capacity to think outside of the language and terms of reference that the party gives to me. In other words, I have to crush my individual identity, the very thing that was set up by Christians to be a consequence of the fact that we bear the image of God, that we have an individual conscience and free will. The very thing that Milton, we began the semester with Milton, his Paradise Lost, was at pains to assert. Remember, he said at the end, Gabriel says to Adam and Eve, as their final consolation for the paradise they've lost, if you add deeds answerable to your faith, add good works, add character, and then you will have within yourself a paradise within, happier far. This freedom and this ideal that Milton so strongly believed, that again he and his contemporaries were involved in a war against the oppression of conscience under Charles I and his followers. This idea is now being played out in a far more rigorous, and to use the words being used in this novel, a far more not systematic, but and not what's the word that was used in also in Heart of Darkness? Not systematic, not rigorous, but efficient. A far more efficient. Efficiency is what distinguishes. What do we mean by efficiency there? This is a consistent theme that we've seen all the way back from A Modest Proposal. It's the efficiency, it's the calculus, it's the mathematical precision that doesn't allow for anything other than the way things are said to be by those in power. That is now being asserted here with a great deal of strength in a way that is not there in the past. And thus the dehumanization continues. But he says you have to commit an act of self-destruction, an effort of the will. And what is the nature of that? Well, it's the future being a boot stepping on the human face forever. That is what we have to do to ourselves. So we have to crush our own individuality to make us collectivist members of Big Brother. And he paused for a few moments, writes Orwell, as though to allow what he'd been saying to sink in. Do you remember, he went on, writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. Yes, said Winston. O'Brien held up his left hand, its back towards O'Brien, with its thumb hidden and the four fingers extended. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? 4. And if the party says that it is not 4 but 5, then how many? 4. The word ended in a gasp of pain. The needle of the dial had shot up to 55. The sweat had sprung out all over Winston's body. The air tore into his lungs and issued again in deep groans, which even by clenching his teeth, he could not stop. O'Brien watched him, the forefinger still extended. He drew back the lever. This time the pain was only slightly eased. How many fingers, Winston? 4. The needle went up to 60. How many fingers, Winston? 4. 4. What else can I say? 4. The needle must have risen again, but he did not look at it. The heavy, stern face and the 4 fingers filled his vision. The fingers, held up, stood before his eyes like pillars, enormous, blurry, and seeming to vibrate, but unmistakably 4. How many fingers, Winston? 4. Stop it, stop it. How can you go on? 4, 4. How many fingers, Winston? 5, 5, 5. No, Winston, that's no use. You are lying. You still think there are 4. How many fingers, please? 4, 5, 4. Anything you like. Only stop it. Stop the pain. Abruptly, he was sitting up with O'Brien's arm around his shoulders. He had perhaps lost consciousness for a few seconds. The bonds that had held his body down were loosened. He felt very cold. He was shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering, his tears rolling down his face. For a moment, he clung to O'Brien like a baby, curiously comforted by the heavy arm around his shoulders. He had the feeling that O'Brien was his protector. It's Stockholm Syndrome. From some other source, and that it was O'Brien who had saved him from it. You are a slow learner, Winston, said O'Brien gently. How can I help it? He blubbered. How can I help seeing what is in front of my eyes? 2 and 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston, sometimes they are 5. Sometimes they are 3. Sometimes they're all of them at once. You must try harder. It is not easy to become sane. Now, note the use of language here, even insanity. Now, so the word sane means obviously of sound mind. That's the primary thing. But sane has to do with healthy. And the party is what defines health and illness, mental health, mental illness. And it has attributed insanity to a view that holds that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and it cannot equal anything else. In other words, what it has done is it has got rid of the fundamental laws of logic, which govern all thought, without which thinking is impossible, without which reasoning is impossible. These laws of logic go all the way back to Aristotle. One of those laws is the law of identity. Another is the law of non-contradiction. The law of identity says that that when we identify something as this, it's not something else. Anyway, you can go to the Aristotle's 3 laws of logic yourself and explore that. But what O'Brien is requiring here is that when we identify 2 plus 2 as 4, it could also be 3, it could also be 5. Well, then the law of identity no longer holds, in which case logic no longer holds, in which case thinking no longer holds. So what Orwell very cleverly is doing here is an assault on the entire Western tradition of not only free speech, but of thinking as a means of apprehending reality and of relating to one another in a truthful manner. That's the nature of the totalitarian state that he presents here. I was going to deal with the passage. I'm running short on time here. But O'Brien makes it clear to him, 268. Do not imagine that you will save yourself, Winston, however completely you surrender to us. No one who has once gone astray is ever spared. And even if we chose to let you live out the natural term of your life, still you would never escape from us. What happens to you here is forever. Understand that in advance. We shall crush you down to the point from which there is no coming back. Things will happen to you from which you could not recover. If you lived 1,000 years, never again will you be capable of ordinary human feeling. Everything will be dead inside you. Never again will you be capable of love or friendship or joy of living or laughter or curiosity or courage or integrity. You will be hollow. We shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you with ourselves. And then they jolt him, and and he says 3,000, and something happens to him so that he is now being indoctrinated to the point where he does the finger test again. How many fingers do I hold up? You remember this? I just held up with the fingers of my hand to you. You saw 5 fingers. Do you remember that? Yes. O'Brien held up the fingers of his left hand with the thumb concealed. There are 5 fingers there. Do you see 5 fingers? Yes. And he did see them. For a fleeting instance before the scenery of his mind changed, he saw 5 fingers, and there was no deformity. Then everything was normal again, and the old fear, the hatred, and the bewilderment came crowding back again. But there had been a moment. He did not know how long, 30 seconds perhaps, of luminous certainty, when each new suggestions of O'Brien had filled up a patch of emptiness and become absolute truth, and when 2 and 2 could have been 3 as easily as 5, if that were what was needed. It had faded out before O'Brien had dropped his hand. Now, what we find here, and described here presciently by Orwell, is the beginning, I think, of, or a description of the fruition of a view of language which is related to utility, utilitarian views of language in practice ever since John Dewey and the disciples of progressivism in modern education, that reality is there not to be truthful, but rather to be useful. And to be useful, of course, begs the question of for whom? To be useful for whom? And we get modern views of education and of language in the 20th century. And one of the main critiques of that comes up in C.S. Lewis's work, The Abolition of Man, in which he talks about the manipulation of language such that words like goodness and beauty, sublimity is his illustration, no longer have any objective meaning. So he's describing the degeneration of language there, and the chief subject and substance of education being lost to the modern student. Orwell will note the exact same tendency in language. But I mentioned utilitarian views of language. These get represented such that modern views of language in the postmodern academy suggest that what we do with language is we construct a world that we want to live in. And it's in accordance not with the conformity of language to truth or language to an external reality, but with language with what we agree upon within the context of the group that determines what language is, what that reality is. Now, to my understanding, that is exactly what is happening in the postmodern university, is language is being reimagined to reflect the terminology and framework of understanding that those who are charged with educational leadership want them to think and say. And they can call it whatever you want. You can call it justice. You can call it beauty. You can call it integrity. You can call it love. You can call it whatever you want. But it's in conformity with what the terms of language dictate is that reality, not with what lies outside of that, but solely within it. So words relate to other words. Words do not relate to a reality outside of words. Words relate only to words. And that is the means by which postmodern literary theory is established. I get into more of that again in my class in contemporary literary theory. Back to the book here, though. But again, this is the way in which I think Orwell's novel is prescient, more of the academy than it is of the world outside us, although we will note that there are certain features of the modern world that have been picked up by Orwell, among other things, the production of music by means of computer programs and so forth, and other things, and of course the growth in the scope of government and in terms of speech codes and so forth. I talked about that already. Back to O'Brien. He says, 271, do you remember writing in your diary that it did not matter whether I was a friend or an enemy, since I was at least a person who understood you and could be talked to? You were right. I enjoy talking to you. Your mind appeals to me. It resembles my own mind, except that you happen to be insane. Before we bring the session to an end, you can ask me a few questions if you choose. Any question I like? Anything. He saw that Winston's eyes were upon the dial. It switched off. What is your first question? What have you done with Julia? Said Winston. O'Brien smiled again. She betrayed you, Winston. Immediately, unreservedly. I have seldom seen anyone come over to us so promptly. You would hardly recognize her if you saw her. All her rebelliousness, her deceit, her folly, her dirty-mindedness, everything has been burned out of her. It was a perfect conversion, a textbook case. You tortured her? O'Brien left this unanswered. Next question, he said. Does Big Brother exist? Of course he exists. The party exists. Big Brother is the embodiment of the party. Does he exist in the same way as I exist? You do not exist, said O'Brien. Note, Big Brother is a fictional character. It's symbolized by the picture. That is the new human image. That human image, which is a construct of the party, the inner party, is said to have existence, whereas the individual has none. Ideology trumps individuality. The commonality of human nature extinguishes the individuality of human nature. We have a collective identity. We don't have an individual identity. This allows the state to do anything with a human life that it wants. It can determine what human life is at the beginning of life. It can determine what human life is at the end of life. In modern application, it can dictate what constitutes murder. So abortion will not be murder. Euthanasia, assisted suicide, is no longer a species of murder. It's a free choice. Note, the freedom is not extended to the unborn. There's no choice on the part of the unborn in that. This is a determination of what life is. Now, if you can define something at its beginning and at its end, you can define everything in between about it. Because what you're doing is you're giving the authority to determine what human life is to the state. And that itself is a form of reinterpreting reality. And the reality being reinterpreted is what human nature is, which the state itself now says it has the power to, and has largely achieved agreement with that. So he says, you do not exist, said O'Brien. Once again, the sense of helplessness assailed him. He knew, or he could imagine, the arguments which proved his own non-existence, but they were nonsense. They were only a play on words. Did not the statement, you do not exist, contain a logical absurdity? Because there's a you inserted there. But what use was it to say so? His mind shriveled as he thought of the unanswerable mad arguments with which O'Brien would demolish them. I think I exist, he said wearily. I am conscious of my own identity. I was born and I shall die. I have arms and legs. I occupy a particular point in space. No other solid object can occupy the same point simultaneously. In that sense, does Big Brother exist? It is of no importance. He exists. Will Big Brother ever die? Of course not. How could he die? Next question. Does the Brotherhood exist? That, Winston, you will never know. But note, it's Winston's very existence which is being determined here. But this idea of the face being crushed by the boot stamping on it forever is the takeaway line. It reflects the dehumanization which is at the heart of this work. It's a continuation of the things we've seen on the course all the way from the Modest Proposal on through Brave New World to some degree in the death of Ivan Illich, the same sort of dehumanization. It carries on into the 20th century in T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men. It is reflected in C.S. Lewis's work, The Abolition of Man, and it is presented in a memorable way with language that has been invented by Orwell in the novel 1984. And with that, we will move on to Brave New World for our next class.